The quiet of the canyon was almost unbearable, its silence thick as if the land itself was holding its breath. The harsh desert air was heavy against my skin, the sharp scent of dust in the wind mingling with the faintest smell of rain that had yet to arrive. At the entrance to a hidden fissure, the craggy rocks stood stoic, unchanging in the face of time. Yet there was something, just a slight shift in the landscape, like a stone moved that hadn't been there before. A carving, faint but unmistakable, marred the smooth surface of the canyon wall. A single name, jaggedly etched, stared back at me in the flickering light of my flashlight, Evan. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and follow if you believe some names should never fade. Moab in the summer felt like a still photograph, warm golden hues of dust swirling in the air, the soft buzz of cicadas rising with the heat. The town, nestled in the folds of red rock canyons, had a rhythm. Mornings were quiet, the town only coming alive as the sun crept higher and tourists poured in, eager to hike the famous trails or gaze upon the sandstone arches. The evenings, though, that's when Moab felt most like home. The sun set slowly, casting long shadows across the desert floor as the stars began to prick the darkening sky. It was the time when the air cooled just enough to let you breathe, and the world seemed to hold a stillness that made everything feel just right. Evan's world had always been one of observation. A boy who loved the landscapes of his small hometown as much as he loved his camera. He was 17, a quiet middle child in a family that had settled into a comfortable, unremarkable life. His father William worked in the back of his small mechanic shop, the sound of clinking wrenches and the hum of the engine steady and familiar. His mother Linda spent her days behind the register of the local grocery store, smiling at customers, always the one to offer a kind word. Ryan, Evan's older brother, was already away at school in Colorado, leaving Evan to wander often alone with his camera in hand. The town had a way of weaving its own quiet stories, the ebb and flow of life marked by mundane rhythms. In the mornings, you could hear the soft hum of air conditioners running in the heat, the distant roar of jeeps taking tourists into the desert, and the tap of shoes against the pavement as locals went about their daily business. By the time the heat of midday set in, the streets became a ghost town, the town's usual pulse reduced to a slow heartbeat under the weight of the summer sun. But it was Evan more than anyone who seemed to exist in the spaces between. He was different. His obsession with photography had begun at a young age, and by 16 he had saved up enough money to buy a second-hand digital camera. It wasn't the shiny new model most kids his age would have opted for, but it was enough to fuel his passion. He spent weekends roaming the desert, capturing the stark beauty of the canyons and the faded traces of human life that dotted the landscape. Abandoned trailers, old vehicles rusting in the sun, and the eerie stillness of places few people dared to go. His friends noticed his distance. At first, it seemed like a phase part of the changes that come with growing up. But there was something else, something more than the usual teenage rebellion. Evan was becoming consumed with the idea of these hidden, forgotten places, the ones that remained untouched by the world. At school, his teachers noticed how his doodles began to shift from simple sketches to more intricate designs, like old symbols, strange triangles with slashes through them. Some of his classmates laughed about it, but those closest to him could feel the change in his mood. He was no longer the quiet but approachable teenager they once knew. His mother Linda watched as her son withdrew further into himself. She hadn't expected him to stay close forever. That was a part of growing up, but there was something about the way he retreated into his own world that made her uneasy. He spent long hours at the kitchen table laptop, open his fingers, tapping away at the keys as he scrolled through online forums. Linda couldn't make out the exact words on the screen, but the images he seemed drawn to photographs of caves, ancient ruins, places that didn't look like they belonged in the world she knew didn't sit right with her. She mentioned it to William a few times, but he just shrugged it off, saying it was probably just a teenage phase, a fascination with adventure. But then there were the ropes. Carabiners and climbing hooks, small items inconspicuous enough, but they kept showing up in the garage. Linda would find them tucked in drawers or in the back of the truck, as though Evan was preparing for something, though he never said a word. His friends noticed it too. Jamie Lewis, one of Evan's classmates, remembered the day Evan had spoken of places no one knew about. "If you find them, you can leave a mark," he had said, his eyes distant as though lost in thought. It was a remark that hadn't meant much at the time, but in hindsight it felt like a premonition. Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that Evan was preparing for something beyond the life he had known in Moab. The summer months wore on. Days grew hotter, the oppressive heat of August settling in like a heavy blanket over the town. Evan spent more and more time on his own, disappearing into the canyons, chasing after something no one else seemed to understand. His friends, even his family, thought little of it. They chalked it up to the usual teenage restlessness. But then, one evening, Ryan, his older brother, returned from college for a brief visit. It was a moment of reunion, but something wasn't quite right. Ryan noticed the change in Evan, the quiet intensity that had replaced the easygoing nature he once knew. That evening, as they sat outside watching the sun set over the canyon, Ryan remembered Evan's behavior. He'd been distant, almost as if keeping something locked inside a secret he couldn't share. It was like he was waiting for something, Ryan would recall later, his words slow, as if the memory still unsettled him. Evan didn't share much that night, but there was something in his silence that spoke volumes. Afterward, he disappeared into the night as he often did. The last time anyone saw him, he was on a hill overlooking Sand Devil Canyon, his back to the world, scribbling something in his notebook. A few days later, it would all change. The quiet before the storm was more than a passing moment in time. It was the kind of calm that fools you into thinking everything is as it should be. A moment so ordinary, so wrapped in the rhythms of daily life that you never suspect it's the last breath before everything unravels. That evening, when the sun dipped below the horizon, Linda stood by the window watching the road for Evan's return. The porch light flickered in the gathering dusk, but there was no sound of his truck pulling into the driveway. No crunch of tires on the gravel, no familiar creak of the screen door. Just silence. The phone rang around 9 Hosru that morning. A moment of calm that I couldn't have known then would be the last time I'd hear that phone call without a knot in my stomach. It was Evan's mom, Linda. "He's late coming back," she said, her voice tight, but the words held no real weight at the time. Late Evan. Well, sure, it wasn't unheard of. He'd disappear into the desert for hours without a word, only to come back with pictures of some hidden crevice or forgotten ruin. That was just Evan, always off exploring, finding places where no one else dared to go. I didn't think anything of it, just assumed he'd taken a longer route, got distracted. "He'll be fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But as the hours slipped by, something in my gut started to tighten. It was unlike him to be gone for so long without a call. And Linda, she was too quiet on the phone for my liking. I knew Evan well enough to know that even if he was off somewhere with a camera in his hands, he would have let her know by now. That's when I felt the first small seed of unease. Something was wrong. I couldn't shake it. By the time it was noon, Linda called again, this time with a hint of fear in her voice. "There's no sign of him. No truck. No nothing." The truck, his old Ford Ranger, was always parked in the same spot when he went out. So where was it? My thoughts raced. Maybe he just ran out of gas? Maybe he'd pulled off to take a better shot of the canyon. But there was no way to explain the growing silence. I remember walking out to the front porch and looking down the gravel driveway, squinting against the harsh sunlight. The road seemed empty, like it had been for the last few hours. Nothing. No sign of his truck, no dust rising from the road. I tried to push away the uncomfortable feeling that gnawed at me. I made myself busy with chores, but the stillness hung heavy in the air and my mind couldn't stop drifting back to Linda's voice. Her words now felt like a premonition, no sign of him. What did she mean by that Evan always left a sign? I tried to convince myself it was nothing. A miscommunication. Maybe he just forgot his phone, or maybe he'd gotten lost in the canyon. But the more I thought about it, the more absurd that sounded. He knew that desert like the back of his hand. The heat that day was unbearable, close to 100 degrees, the kind of weather that made you sweat before you even stepped outside. But Evan, he was a seasoned hiker. Nothing could stop him in that desert. Still, I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that slow-blooming panic that kept creeping in with each passing hour. By 3:00 in the afternoon, I found myself pacing the house. The phone rang again. Linda. Her voice now had a frantic edge. I found the truck, she said, her words spilling out quickly, but no Evan. I could hear the tremble in her voice. The truck was there, parked off a dirt road just outside Sand Devil Canyon. The doors were locked, the keys nowhere to be found. Inside, his backpack was sitting on the front seat with an empty water bottle and a couple of energy bars. His camera, of course, was gone. But what struck Linda as strange, too strange to ignore, was the lack of his phone wallet, and the one thing Evan would never forget: water. It didn't make sense. How could he go off without water? It was a basic rule in the desert: you never ever hike in that heat without water. The sun was already high in the sky when she found the truck. The temperature had climbed to over 95 degrees, the kind of heat that could fry your skin in minutes. Even the most seasoned desert dwellers knew you couldn't survive long without water, especially in the terrain around Sand Devil Canyon. And yet here was Evan's truck abandoned, the keys gone, his belongings inside, but no sign of him. Linda was beside herself, and I couldn't help but feel that cold grip of dread that had started tightening around my chest. I went over everything in my mind, trying to piece together a story, something to explain this. He had to be nearby, right? Maybe he wandered off, fell, or got stuck. But there was something unsettling about it all. It wasn't just the truck. It was the absence of him. No tracks in the dust, no trail leading from the truck. Just empty desert. I could feel the tension in the air. Linda was already trying to contact anyone who might help. She'd called the police, and by the time the sun started to dip lower in the sky, search teams had begun assembling. But it felt wrong. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that weighed heavy, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. I could tell from the way Linda talked that she was spiraling, and I didn't know how to calm her down. There was nothing to suggest foul play, no evidence of a struggle, no signs of forced entry. But still, something gnawed at me, and I knew I wasn't the only one feeling it. The town, too, was starting to hum with an uneasy energy. People gathered in little groups at the coffee shop, whispering behind the counters, exchanging worried glances. But no one knew what to say. The mystery of Evan's disappearance didn't have an easy answer. At first, it seemed like it was probably nothing. But the longer it went on, the more it became clear that this wasn't just some teenage rebellion or an accidental misstep. Something was wrong. The hours dragged on. Each passing minute felt like an eternity, and as the sun finally set, it became clear no one was coming back tonight. The streets of Moab grew quieter, darker. The porch light flickered on, casting a pale yellow glow over the empty driveway, where Evan's truck still sat silent. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, waiting for a sound, a movement, anything. But the silence in the air only deepened, stretching into something heavy and suffocating. It wasn't until well after dark that I saw the first sheriff's cruiser pull up to the house. The headlights cut through the dark like a thin beam, and I couldn't help but notice how they lit up the long stretch of empty road. As the deputy stepped out, he removed his hat, his movements slow and deliberate, as if trying to avoid disturbing the stillness. He walked up to the door and knocked. The kind of knock you feel in your bones before you even answer. And that's when I knew. The kind of knowing that leaves a pit in your stomach, a certainty that something had shifted, but no one could say exactly what. The mystery was no longer an inconvenience or a misunderstanding. Something had happened. Something that was bigger than all of us. And whatever it was just beginning to unfold. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the town of Moab was buzzing with a quiet sort of tension. Deputies started arriving early that evening, their cruisers lighting up the streets with flashing reds and blues. The sound of radios crackling distant conversations and boots on gravel filled the air. The volunteers trickled in some familiar faces, others strangers, all coming together for a common cause. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't just a teenager out for a long hike anymore. This was bigger. I could feel the weight of it settle around us, like the thick heat of a summer night, heavy and unyielding. The search had officially begun. The rangers gathered around their trucks, maps spread out across hoods marking possible routes and areas to cover. I remember seeing Linda, her face pale, her eyes distant. She stood at the edge of the group, clutching her jacket to her chest, unable to sit still. I stood beside her, feeling my own hands tremble. People were preparing checking gear, talking in low tones. I watched as a deputy met with the rangers pointing toward the canyon. The distance between us and the edge of the desert felt infinite. Each search team that left the parking lot felt like a small step into a vast unknown. But there was nothing easy about it. There was no denying the gravity of the situation anymore. The desert around Sand Devil Canyon is a vast, unforgiving place. It feels like the land swallows you whole, leaving no trace. I could see them as they moved through the dry, cracked earth, scanning the ravines, searching the narrow trails that wound through the rock formations. It was all so quiet, save for the soft hum of a helicopter circling overhead, its rotors cutting through the still air. The search dogs, their noses twitching and tails low, worked in silent coordination. They were trained, they were reliable, but it felt like they were chasing ghosts. The air was thick with dust, making every movement in the canyon seem impossibly slow, like the land itself was reluctant to give up its secrets. The search teams hiked up the narrow trails with radios in hand, calling out coordinates and updates to the crew stationed at base camp. They paused occasionally, peering down into the deep ravines below, but nothing ever seemed to change. Each area cleared, each checkpoint checked off felt like another piece of hope slipping away. There were no signs of struggle, no tracks that led anywhere definitive. Just endless, barren desert. And still no sign of Evan. At some point, we all started to feel the same sinking weight, the quiet dread that came with each clear report. We had hoped, I think, for anything. A footprint in the dust, a piece of clothing caught on a bush. But as the hours ticked by, the lines on the maps remained unchanged. No one had found anything. The early assumptions we'd held, the quiet hope that Evan had simply gotten lost, began to fade with each passing moment. The land didn't offer anything to grasp onto, not even a glimmer of a clue. Somewhere deeper in the canyon, a hiker found a small campsite, but it didn't seem right. A fire pit, yes, but no signs that anyone had stayed for long. The smell of charred wood lingered in the air, but it was as if the fire had been left to die in silence. I remember standing there, the soft crackle of the fire's remains still in the air, and realizing that this wasn't the kind of place Evan would have chosen to camp. He would have set up somewhere out of sight, somewhere quieter, somewhere no one else would think to look. But there was nothing in that small campsite that matched his style. No camera, no notebook. It was just a spot empty like all the others. The search continued through the night, through the cool, biting air that comes with desert evenings. I don't know if it was the fatigue or the stillness, but something about the quiet that night felt different. I could hear the distant hum of the helicopter, but the rest of the world seemed to fade into a soft hush, like we were all holding our breath. Linda stood a little further away, her shoulders slumped, her eyes scanning the canyon as if she might somehow will Evan to appear. I could feel the shift in her, the rawness that no words could touch. The minutes stretched on, and each hour felt like another crack in the fragile hope we'd all clung to. The rumors started to spread through town like wildfire. People whispered about the canyon, some calling it cursed, others talking about strange happenings in the area over the years. Old stories about lost hikers and wanderers who had vanished without a trace. They were just stories, I thought. Things to pass the time. But then I caught a conversation between two deputies, their faces tight as they spoke in low tones, exchanging looks that said more than their words ever could. They knew something, but they weren't saying it. There was an undercurrent of fear, a kind of tension in the air, like everyone had already begun to understand that this wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. It was something deeper, something darker. The more we heard, the more the theories began to pile up. Some said Evan had just decided to disappear, that he was tired of his small-town life and wanted to escape. I didn't believe that for a second. Evan was a lot of things, but he wasn't a runaway. He didn't leave behind clues like this, signs that he was planning to disappear. Others thought maybe he had gotten into some kind of trouble, but nothing seemed to fit. Not his camera, not the absence of any struggle. The desert felt bigger than us, stretching out with its shadows, its quiet, and its secrets, and each step we took to uncover the truth felt more like a step into the unknown. I could feel the exhaustion settling in my bones, the frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. We had searched the land from sunrise to sunset, and every hour seemed to push us further into a maze of empty possibilities. No one had seen him. No one had found anything that made sense, and the silence, that unrelenting silence, felt heavier with every passing second. We all began to wonder, was he even out there at all? Had we missed something? Had the canyon hidden him in ways we couldn't understand? And then, in the early hours of the next morning, it happened. A deputy walked up to the map with something in his hand, something small, something significant. He didn't say a word at first, just laid it down next to the paper where the search routes were drawn out, his face unreadable. For a moment the world seemed to pause, as if everyone around me knew this was the moment the game had changed, but no one could say why. The maps had already been marked with countless X's, all the places we'd looked, all the spots we'd cleared. But now something was different. I couldn't explain it, not then, not even now. But when the deputy's fingers brushed the edge of that map, I knew the truth was finally starting to emerge, and it wasn't going to be simple. The shift came slowly, like the tightening of a grip around your chest that you don't quite notice until it's too late. It started with a call over the radio. A voice crackling, barely audible at first, then louder as it came through clearer. "We've found something. Get over here now." My heart dropped before I even understood why. The words, though simple, carried an urgency I hadn't heard before. No more search teams casually brushing through the canyon. This was different. There was something there, something real. I didn't need to be told twice. I moved without thinking toward the group that had gathered near the new trailhead. The scene was starting to form a kind of quiet chaos that felt foreign after days of methodical searching. Deputies, rangers, volunteers, they moved faster now, eyes scanning the canyon, the mountains of stone that seemed to stretch endlessly around us. There was a pulse in the air, a certain gravity in the steps of the people around me. The radios were buzzing with updates, but it was the silence between the words that told me all I needed to know. Whatever was coming, it wasn't going to be easy to digest. The dust kicked up as they secured the area. A yellow tape was stretched across the base of a narrow path leading into the canyon, a makeshift barrier that marked the change in the course of everything. I could hear the faint scrape of boots against stone, the soft snap of branches as people cut through the underbrush. Then came the shift, the moment when you realize you're standing on the edge of something that's already begun to change the world, you know. The quiet before the storm, that's what it felt like. But I wasn't sure what the storm would be. I stood there for a long moment, watching the investigators move, trying to steady myself. My thoughts kept returning to Evan. Where had he gone? Was this all just a fluke, an accident? I couldn't say. But then the smell of the desert hit me harsh and dry, and I heard a muffled sound from across the clearing. A shout followed by a wave of movement, hurried footsteps, voices, low, urgent. And then, like a veil lifting the scene, was clear. Someone had found something. Something that didn't belong. I remember the cold air around me thickening, a sudden shift in temperature as the group began to crowd around a specific spot. The ground was dry here, cracked and fragile, like the earth itself had been waiting for this moment. The investigators moved carefully, scanning the area, their bodies blocking the view for a few moments. Then came the sight of something that hit me harder than I expected, a piece of cloth caught on a jagged rock, weathered by the desert sun. It wasn't just any cloth. It was something too familiar. I didn't recognize it at first, but when I looked closer, it became clear it was part of a shirt frayed at the edges, its pattern indistinct from the fading desert colors. My chest tightened. This wasn't something that belonged to anyone who had just been wandering around. This was something left behind, discarded, or abandoned. It felt like a clue, and in the same instant, it felt like an end. But then the investigators shifted their attention. The body of the search began to take shape as they moved from one section to another, their bodies working in unison, their feet crunching the ground. The scene around me seemed to freeze for a moment. Everything was happening so slowly, but my pulse was quickening. They found more than just the cloth. There was a flashlight, its lens cracked but still recognizable, sitting half buried under some loose dirt. Not far from it, a small pile of rocks was stacked in a careful formation, as if someone had left it there deliberately. There were signs of a person, but they were fragments. They didn't belong to anyone who was supposed to be here. They didn't belong to anyone who was still walking among us. The weight of the moment hit me in waves. I could feel my knees weaken, the sense of dread settling deeper into my bones. I couldn't move. My feet were planted in place like I was watching someone else, watching them uncover the quiet terror that had been hidden under the surface for so long. It was the first real evidence we had undeniable concrete proof that Evan had been here. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to understand what had happened, to know where he was or who had been involved. It wasn't enough to make sense of any of it. The quiet that followed felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. The rangers, the deputies, they all stood still for a moment, some of them staring at the small pile of evidence, others trying to mask their own shock. No one spoke. The air felt colder than it had before, and the canyon around us felt even bigger, its silence suffocating. There was a strange stillness that overtook the group, a silence that wasn't natural, as though even the earth had stopped to acknowledge what was happening. I could feel the numbness creeping into my bones, the kind of numbness that settles in when you're standing on the edge of something awful, but you can't quite face it yet. I didn't know what to do with my hands. I couldn't stop looking at that flashlight, that piece of cloth, the rocks. They were all small fragments, pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. The truth was beginning to unravel, but I wasn't ready for it. And yet here it was right in front of me. Then the call came. A voice over the radio, a calm but firm tone cutting through the quiet. "We've confirmed it. This is his." The words hit me with the force of a gust of wind. I hadn't been prepared for the truth. I should have been, but I wasn't. Not like this. Not like what it meant. They hadn't found Evan yet, but the pieces were starting to fall into place. What they had found, what they were beginning to understand, was that this wasn't an accident. It wasn't just a case of a teenager getting lost. It wasn't just a boy who had wandered too far and gotten caught in the heat. No, this was something more, something deliberate. Evan had left a trail, had made his way into the canyon with purpose, and something had happened to him there. But who had been involved? The question loomed, and I couldn't shake it. As the site was secured, officials moved in, and I could feel the shift from searchers to investigators. The case had just taken a darker turn, and no one was talking, not yet. I could see Linda standing at the edge of the group, her body still, her face unreadable. I couldn't bring myself to look at her. Not yet. The night stretched on the desert's cool air, mixing with the uncertainty that hung in the air. We were left standing in the aftermath, trying to absorb what had just been uncovered, knowing that whatever came next, it would be impossible to undo. The truth was out there now, but it was still a long way from being understood. Later, I would find myself sitting in a small room at the sheriff's office, the weight of the discovery pressing down on me. There was a press conference being prepared, and I knew the news would spread fast. The walls seemed to close in as I waited. A door clicked open. The night ahead would be long, but it was nothing compared to what was coming. And all I could do was wait for the next chapter of this dark tale to unfold. The days that followed the discovery felt like a blur. It was as if the world had shifted beneath our feet, leaving us all standing in the middle of something we couldn't yet fully grasp. The sheriff's office moved quickly, locking down the site and gathering all the evidence that had been uncovered. They cordoned off the area, a line of yellow tape marking the boundary of what we all knew had been a long-awaited, terrifying revelation. Officers and rangers were everywhere, documenting the scene, collecting whatever was left behind. It was an overwhelming feeling, that sudden weight, the heavy realization that everything we thought we knew had shifted. And of course, it was the waiting that made it worse, waiting for the truth to come fully into focus. Linda Evans' mother was in a daze. She sat at the edge of the group, looking out at the canyon, the place where her son had last been, her eyes blank. She hardly spoke. I could see it in her face the moment it all fell, in the knowledge that Evan had been here, but not in the way she had hoped. She had wanted something more, some answer, some trace that he had been lost in the desert, waiting to be found. But this wasn't a lost boy. This was something else. I remember thinking that if anyone could make sense of this, it would be her. But I don't think anyone could. Not yet. The town felt different after that. I think everyone knew it, but no one said it. The small, familiar routines people had clung to were suddenly heavy with uncertainty. Moab, a place that had always seemed too small for the vastness of its landscape, now felt impossibly large. The desert stretched on forever, and everything seemed to echo louder than before. The usual hum of the coffee shop, the chatter of tourists along Main Street. It was all quieter, as if the land itself had swallowed up the noise. We kept our distance, each of us carrying the weight of what had been uncovered, but not quite sure how to set it down. For Linda, the days that followed felt like an endless loop of paperwork, of phone calls, of people telling her that they were doing everything they could. The sheriff's office worked diligently, piecing together what little they had. The discovery was a turning point, no doubt, but we still didn't know what had happened, how it had all come to this. I could see it in Linda's face when she spoke to the officers, the quiet desperation behind every question. She wanted answers. We all did. But what we learned, what we had already started to piece together, made it clear there was more to this than just a boy getting lost in the desert. Evan had been planning something. This wasn't just a random hike or a reckless decision to wander off. No, Evan had made choices, and somewhere along the way, someone else had made theirs. The findings, the flashlight, the clothes, the strange pile of rocks, all spoke of a deliberate, calculated decision to keep Evan in that canyon. The more the investigators looked into his computer history, the more they found threads of conversations, messages exchanged with someone he'd met online, someone who had, for reasons we still didn't fully understand, lured him in. That person, who had gone by the name Deep Path, had been pushing Evan toward the idea of exploring hidden places in the canyon. The messages were filled with hints and suggestions, words that now sounded ominous in hindsight. The investigation into the mystery of Deep Path continued, but they never found out who he truly was. The authorities followed every lead they could, but the trail ended there. As for Evan's family, we were left to pick up the pieces. His father, William, who had always been so grounded, was lost in his own way. The quiet strength he'd always shown cracked a little, and I could see how much it hurt to think that he hadn't known his son in the way he'd thought. The silence between him and Linda grew longer, heavier, like the space between the stars on a cloudless night. They'd never been the kind of family to show their feelings openly, but after the discovery, the weight of it seemed to pull them apart, not together. Their grief, their pain was something they carried quietly hidden beneath a layer of normalcy that was slowly slipping away. Months passed, and though the case remained open, the community's eyes started to turn elsewhere. The reporters moved on, the search teams faded, but the questions remained. What had happened to Evan? Why had it all unfolded the way it did? We may never know, and that perhaps is the hardest thing to live with. There's no neatly tied-up ending to this story, no arrest, no closure, just the cold truth of what had happened and the endless wondering of how it all came to be. The canyon where Evan had disappeared remained unchanged. The dust still settled softly on the rocks, the wind still whispered through the narrow ravines. But for those of us who knew the story, knew the boy, it would never be the same. We couldn't look at that landscape without remembering the quiet, the stillness, the loss. I still pass by the canyon sometimes, though not as often as I once did. The town is quieter now, more subdued. The places that used to feel familiar now hold echoes of what happened. The diner where Evan used to sit with his friends, the park bench by the river, where he'd spent hours waiting for the perfect shot. All of it feels like a different world. The landscape hasn't changed. It's still the same sweeping red rock and endless sky, but the way I see it is different. The weight of that day, the discovery lingers in every corner, in every quiet moment. It's as though the canyon itself holds the secret of what happened just out of reach. I've learned a lot in the years since, more than I ever thought I would. I've learned how fragile life can be, how quickly things can change. But I've also learned that some things never leave you. The memories, the questions, the loss, they're all still there lingering in the quiet moments of the day. I've tried to find peace with it in my own way, but it's hard when you know that some answers may never come. The hardest part, I think, is knowing that Evan didn't just vanish. He was taken somewhere, dragged into a place that wasn't meant for him. And that will always hang over this town, over us. I can still see him in my mind, his quiet, determined look when he talked about exploring the desert, the way he'd always carry that camera with him, like it was his tether to the world. I wonder what he saw before everything went dark for him, and I wonder if he ever truly knew what he was walking into. Sometimes when I'm alone, I still hear the sound of footsteps in the distance, or the soft rustle of a breeze through the canyons. It's the kind of sound that carries a weight, a memory. And even now, all these years later, I still think of him. I still think of what could have been. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.